Now, the European Union's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, has promised that the bloc takes 90% of revenues from Russian assets frozen in Europe and transfers them to buy weapons for Ukraine. Under Mr Borrell's plans, proceeds from the assets, such as interest payments, would go to the European Peace Facility, which provides military aid to countries outside the EU. Russian officials have called that move potential theft and warned about potential consequences for those who actually make those decisions. Well, earlier I spoke to Timothy Ash, who's an economist and associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House. He gave me his assessment of the figures being talked about.
It's 3 to 4 billion euros a year. The total amount of assets, Russian assets, frozen in Western jurisdictions is about $330 billion. That's cash. That's Russian government cash in Western jurisdictions. The cost to fund Ukraine annually is about $100 billion a year. Unfortunately, $61 billion is stuck in the US House of Congress. There's a massive hole in terms of Ukraine's financing. Western governments should really allocate the underlying assets. That's the 300-odd billion, which would help Ukraine meet that financing gap, fund its military needs. It will be able to buy the weapons it needs to defend itself and ensure victory. So, this is not really a success, I think, from the Europeans. It's a big fudge.
I know you describe it as a fudge, but if they were to cross that line, is there anything that really stops them going much further, as you suggest?
Well, it's been done before. Remember, the first Gulf War, Iraqi central bank assets were seized by the international community and were allocated to Kuwait. Also, Afghani central bank reserves were done. There is a sovereign state immunity defence, but actually the argument against is a countermeasures argument that sovereign immunity only counts when that country is acting according to international law. Russia clearly isn't. It's invaded Ukraine, it's committed war crimes, probably genocide. The moral national defence and I think economic argument for actually seizing the assets and giving them to Ukraine is pretty strong, I would argue.
Yes. I mean, in terms of Moscow and Vladimir Putin, Moscow has already called it theft, the act of bandits, breaching international law, all of that you would expect to come from the Kremlin. But are there actually any practical obstacles that actually would prevent this happening?
Well, not really. It's political will, ultimately. I mean, laws are made by politicians. Our governments want to do it. Unfortunately, at the moment, what's happening is that $100 billion bill is essentially being paid by Western taxpayers, where Russian taxpayers' money is stuck in Western banks, but our governments are not willing to actually go after it. They rather spend Western taxpayers' money than actually spend Russian taxpayers' money, which I would think should be a political scandal in Western countries. But, politicians are sweeping this all under the carpet.
I've only got about 40 seconds left, if you would. So briefly, the impact on Russia if they were to do this, because these are assets that have been frozen now for 2 years. So they have lived without this money. So does it have any significant impact in terms of Russia itself, do you think?
Well, actually, the more interesting question is what happens if we don't do it for Ukraine. If we don't give Ukraine this money, it doesn't have the money to fund its own defence, loses the war, and the impact on Europe of tens of millions of Ukrainians fleeing west, the fact that we'll have to spend a lot more on our own defence, probably 1 to 2 percentage points of GDP, that's hundreds of billions of dollars annually extra, and it will create huge social, political instability in Europe. So that's, I think, the most important point.
Timothy Ash talking to me a little earlier on the programme.